Tonight, we are here to listen to you. The format will be that we will hear a brief presentation to give everyone an overview, and then we will open up to hear people's comments. The town council, if they choose so, they will have the opportunity to comment. At this point in time, I would like to introduce our town manager, Ellen Zapusasu. There you are. Okay, welcome.
And if the town council members want to see the presentation, they can go into the front row. But before we start, I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview as to why we are here. The Plan of Conservation and Development that has been drafted is a 51-page document at this point. But more importantly is why it's required. Public Act number 15-95 mandates that every municipality create a municipal plan of conservation and develop it and update it every 10 years. So this is the document that I brought, and I want to just spend a quick minute talking about the language. Most of the language includes the word shall, which is a mandate from the state government to municipal government. The first section reads, at least once every 10 years, the Commission shall prepare or amend and shall adopt a plan of conservation and development for the municipality. The next section says, in preparation of such plan, the Commission may appoint one or more special committees to develop and make recommendations for the plan, and Enfield did have a steering committee. Subsection D, in preparing such plan, the Commission or any special committee shall consider the following. Again, shall consider the following. And there is a subsection of multiple conceptual ideas that must be included in every municipality's plan of conservation and development. One of them is that it must consider the need for affordable housing. It must consider the use of cluster development and other developmental patterns to the extent consistent with soil types, terrain, and infrastructure. It shall consider the state plan of conservation and development, the regional plan of conservation and development, as well as physical, social, economic, and governmental conditions and trends. It also must consider the needs of the municipality, including but not limited to human resources, education, health, housing, recreation, social services, public utilities, public protection, transportation, and circulation. Subsection E discusses that such plan of conservation and development shall be a statement of policies, goals, and standards for the physical and economic development of the municipality. This is a guidance document. Another portion, subsection E of that, says that it is to recommend the most desirable density of population in the several parts of the municipality. The plan must also make provision for the development of housing opportunities, including opportunities for multifamily dwellings consistent with soil types, terrain, etc. It must also promote housing choice and economic diversity in housing, including housing for both low and moderate income households, and encourage the development of housing which will meet the housing needs identified in the state's consolidated plan for housing and community development. This public act goes on to spell out additional parts of the process. We're going to make this available for people to reference, but as you can see, it is a very complex mix of issues that has to be addressed within the Plan of Conservation and Development, and one that has been in process for the last few years. In doing so, most communities will rely upon a consultant to help guide that process, and that is what Enfield did. So tonight, with us to do the presentation, to provide everybody with an overview, is Donald Poland. He is the Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Planning and Strategy for Goldman & York. He has over 27 years of experience in land use planning, real estate development, housing, economic development, and neighborhood investment. He's worked in both the public and private sectors as well as for a nonprofit and also academia. Dr. Poland offers a very unique perspective, and I think is one of the reasons that Enfield probably retained him, which was before my time, in terms of all of the complexities that I just outlined to you. He is also a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He is a certified zoning enforcement official. He is past president of the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association and a fellow with the Connecticut Policy Institute. So What I found most interesting about his bio, with all of the things that he must manage, he also earned his PhD from the University College London, Department of Geography, and his doctoral research focused on urban ecology and ecological resilience, which obviously is one of the main issues that I've been hearing in my office from a lot of residents. Also with us tonight is our town planner, Lori Whitten, who you will be hearing from later, who will be spelling out the work of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the process, and where we stand now, and what happens over the next several weeks. So with no further ado, I'd like to cede the floor to Dr. Poland so that he can provide everyone in attendance tonight with an overview of where we are and how we got here. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction. So, for the record, Don Poland, Goldman York Property Advisors. I'm here tonight to give a presentation of the Plan of Conservation Development, or the draft plan. Lori, next slide, please. This will be a general overview. I'm going to quickly touch on a few things that were just discussed about process, then the planning process for the creation of this plan, and then I'm going to go through the organization, the thematic chapters, and the target investment areas that are contemplated within the draft plan. Included in that, in those thematic chapters, is the chapter on housing, but I also recognize there's some specific concerns related to housing, so I'm going to spend a little more time on housing at the end of the presentation. Next slide. And next one. So the POCD is a statement of policies, goals, and standards of the physical, economic, and economic development of the municipality. It is the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendations for the use of land, the most desirable use of land throughout the community. As was already stated, it is a policy guide, it is a recommendation, it is non-binding. The Commission must consider it when making certain decisions, but they are not bound to it. They can actually decide indifference to it moving forward. And it is designed to promote and coordinate development of the municipality and general welfare and prosperity. Next slide. The general process that we used in creating this plan is to evaluate physical, demographic, socioeconomic, and environmental trends within the municipality to ultimately determine what is most important to the community. Then it's kind of this layered approach of first identifying those things that are to be protected and conserved. Once you know what you're going to protect, then you can make decisions about what you're going to develop, residential, commercial, industrial, and so on. And then once you know what you're developing and also what you're protecting, you can start to determine density, intensity, and then ultimately the infrastructure, public infrastructure that's needed to support the development, including community facilities. Next slide. Using the concept of sustainable development, I want to make a key point here. There is a tendency once POCDs are adopted, and I'm guilty of it myself when representing applicants, is the idea of kind of cherry picking a plan to find the statements that support whatever it is you want to do or not want to do. And I always think it's important to make clear that the definition of sustainable development, the last sentence states that doing so must integrate and balance economic, environmental, and social goals. With the POCD, just because one section of the POCD may say, if you could go back to that slide.
Sorry about that.
Just because one section of the plan may say protect this, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's at the exclusion of, say, economic and social goals, or vice versa. If it says develop this, that doesn't necessarily mean it's at the exclusion of the environmental goals. The fact is we need to find that balance, strike that balance, and let's say it's a development encroaching into a sensitive natural area, then how do you mitigate the impacts to the natural environment? So I really want to emphasize the idea of balance. Next. Next slide. This committee, the steering committee, was established approximately 2 years ago. It met almost monthly up until, I believe, last September. I believe over that period of time, only 2 or 3 months were missed, so there were regular monthly public meetings with the steering committee. There was a virtual kickoff in April of 21, community survey in the spring of 21, department head interviews in the fall of 21, a community facility survey in the spring of 2020, and then public outreach meeting in person in April of 22, and the Thompsonville outreach program, which was in August of 22. Over the course of time, a number of reports and presentations were issued in which the committee was presented with topics, was presented with potential policy recommendations, and discussions were engaged in. Next slide. Next. This is just an overview of the chapter structure. I'm not going to go through it. Next slide. So the thematic recommendations, all of these pages have a lot of information on them. I am not reading them to you verbatim, nor am I going to focus on each and every one of the items. I want you to see kind of the number of and kind of recommendations that are being made within each of the thematic sections. So the first thematic section of the document deals with this idea of the cultural landscape. It's kind of the core values of the community, especially in the natural setting. So things like historic districts, scenic resources, the Connecticut and Scantic River, agriculture and land preservation, all come into play within this section, and ultimately specific recommendations on enhancing those qualities within the community. Next slide. The plan then goes into a lengthy section on natural resources. And it's lengthy because there's so many different topics to be covered in this area. So it starts with a section on floodplain regulations with recommendations like acquiring flood-prone property or updating the flood maps through a more detailed study, which is a process you can engage in with FEMA to make sure you have the most accurate and up-to-date mapping. The second section focused specifically on inland wetlands and watercourse, and we had substantial input, I believe, from the Inland Wetlands Commission on this. Creating public awareness about the importance, a guidebook to wetlands, updating the wetlands map, creating a more detailed wetlands map, identifying and ranking wetlands by quality. In the world of wetlands, there are some that are very high quality and there are some that are very poor quality. How you're going to approach them from a preservation perspective may differ. Next slide. There was then a section on aquifer protection, stormwater management, and ultimately development in sensitive areas. And all three of these, focusing in on additional environmental quality issues. Next slide. And then, I believe this is the last slide in natural resources, open space conservation, and then agricultural conservation and preservation. Things like expanding the Public Act 490, that's the taxing policy around agriculture and open space land uses, or increasing the number and location of community gardens is another recommendation, creating a farm-friendly zoning regulation, and encouraging agritourism as another example of a recommendation within the plan. Next slide. Oh, I still have another slide here. I knew I couldn't get away from it. So then confronting climate change, community facilities and capital improvements is a way of looking at that. Zoning regulations, consideration of tax abatements and energy efficiency programs. Tree preservation was another area of strategies, becoming recognized as a tree city, encouraging planting of native trees and implementing a tree planting program. And then the adoption of the CROG, the Capital Region Council of Governments Natural Hazards Action Plan. CROG did a regional action plan with specific municipal plans for each of the communities within its region. So we reviewed and ultimately utilized this plan within the POCD. Next slide. Residential. I'll go through each of these briefly, and then as I said, I'm going to come back to housing at the end. But housing need and affordable housing plan. Encourage and provide diversity of housing types, tenure, and affordability to all incomes. Allow multifamily in the BR, BP, and I1 zones. other multifamily strategies such as reducing parking requirements, allowing mixed-use developments in the BR and BP zoning districts, creating a permitting process that is swift, simple, and certain, utilizing tax abatements to encourage housing as part of redevelopment projects, not in and of themselves, but as part of redevelopment projects, establishing a housing trust fund, which is essentially a statutory authorized program where you can actually capture funds into a specific dedicated fund to be used for housing, and creating inclusionary zoning provisions. Next slide. Also creating, that duplicated over. Creating a inclusionary zoning provision, a small lot open space subdivision or a cluster development recommendation, addressing non-conforming subdivisions, creating a affordable housing committee to oversee implementation of kind of public outreach and so forth and education around that, promoting transit-oriented development in relationship to the train station in Thompsonville, and then some specific related to 8-30J affordable housing plan, which I'll discuss a bit later at the end of this presentation. Continue to sponsor and expand first-time homebuyer programs, allow accessory dwelling units, work with nonprofits and for-profit developers, and also to explore other opportunities for mid-density missing middle housing. Next slide. So after the housing component, then looking at economic development, recognizing some of the challenges confronting Enfield with commercial development, trying to remove barriers to investment through the zoning process, encouraging and allowing greater density and diversity of land uses, providing incentives to overcome high cost of redevelopment. I just want to pause on this for a second. Redeveloping something like the mall becomes much more costly than building on a greenfield. You have environmental remediation things like addressing lead paint, asbestos, and also demolition of potentially portions of the structure. Those are all upfront costs that even come before the cost of development, therefore recognizing possible need for public participation and incentives. Streamlining the land use application process and with a recommendation for a specific approach, and creating a well-defined economic development program. Next slide. So, having gone through the conservation, the residential development, the commercial development, we now arrive at kind of the infrastructure or community facilities. 4 key recommendations under community facilities: create a comprehensive community facilities plan. I recognize that there is a fairly recent plan that was created for the community related to community facilities, but it is not all-inclusive. It does not cover all your facilities. If one thing became very evident throughout this process is you have a lot of facilities and a lot of upkeep to do, and I really feel that a comprehensive all-inclusive study would be beneficial to the community. Implementing a comprehensive building maintenance program, investing in social services, as this is under community facilities as a community program. The fact is, the social services kind of lay a foundation to addressing social and economic aspects of the community, and therefore I view it as a critical infrastructure. Investing in amenities. With the committee, we had long discussions about amenities, and these are kind of things that enhance quality of life: walking trails, biking trails, those things that an active population today seek out and want to be part of, want to have as part of their community. Next slide. Specific to infrastructures, encouraging alternative modes of transportation, expanding sidewalks and walkability within the commercial areas in Thompsonville, implementing low-impact design standards. These are related to stormwater management, incorporating access management requirements in zoning. This is an approach of reducing curb cuts on the major roads to reduce congestion. Continuing the road paving program, which is actually a very effective capital improvements program you guys run, and continuing the MS4, which is stormwater management compliance program. The most significant recommendation related to public infrastructure is the creation of a sewer avoidance map. There's statutory authorities that the state requires a community to identify sewer avoidance areas. This is to reduce future costs of improvements to wastewater treatment facilities, since the state contributes. I believe Enfield had a draft map that I don't think was ever officially adopted into the POCD. So we now have that in this POCD as it's required by law. Next slide. And sustainability and resilience, focusing on some things like renewable alternatives, the implementation of renewables, the increase in public charging facilities capacity. There's actually recently, last year, passed state law that mandates some requirements related to charging facilities, zoning for charging capacity, and then also renewable leadership, kind of establishing some responsibilities within local government to lead on this. Next slide. And then a specific section on Thompsonville, recommending for an investment strategy to reposition the neighborhood to better compete, continuing the implementation of CDBG funding, the promotion and utilization of the TIF district that you guys established a few years back, consideration of a tax abatement program, zoning regulations to address non-conforming bulk and area requirements, investments in the public realm, public infrastructures, whether it be sidewalks, town green, new loan programs potentially for facade improvements and exterior improvements to other buildings, and homeowner assistance program. Typically, a POCD culminates in a land use plan. We didn't do the conventional land use plan, and we did this what we call target investment areas. The fact is, you're an older, more mature community with a well-established land use pattern. We didn't want to affect the existing residential neighborhoods. That is, we didn't want to make recommendations to change the zoning within those existing residential neighborhoods. Nor did we see a need to make drastic changes to the zoning within commercial and industrial areas in town. But the fact is, there are areas in town that need specific attention. Next slide. So a series of target investment areas were ultimately focused on. Next slide. The first of which is the regional shopping district, centered around the 190 corridor and the Enfield Square Mall. Next slide. There are two corporate campus areas, one at Moody Road, and encompassing some industrial properties, some office properties, including the Lego facility. The next one, next slide, is the Mass Mutual facility as a second target area in the corporate campus areas. Next slide. While the plan took a look at all of Thompsonville, for the target investment area, we focus on the north end of Thompsonville, that is north of the 190 corridor. Next slide. And then recognizing changing, policies and programs from the state related to the state prison system, kind of a target investment area that says, establish a dialogue, pay attention, and if opportunities arise in that portion of the community, then you need to be prepared to plan for what is the future of that area. Next slide. Last but not least, then ultimately your existing industrial park area with some recommendations about maybe expanding opportunities there. Next slide. The last target investment area is ultimately the conservation area, and we have three things here. What's called natural diversities. These are sensitive habitats, protected open spaces, and ultimately farmland. Next slide. When I said early on the idea of balance, as you will notice, many of these target investment areas, the specific development ones, overlay over the top of the conservation-related areas. Therefore, neither are mutually exclusive. The idea here is if you have a proposed development within your target investment area that also has conservation areas, then you need to heighten your awareness to the conservation needs and find ways to find balance, to mitigate the negative impacts. So the last section of the plan is ultimately, or the last substantive section of the plan is ultimately the implementation section, where we provide a detailed list of kind of priorities and allocation of agencies that would be involved in the application of those, implementation of those items. So the last thing I want to touch on is a few things about housing, recognizing it's been a focus. Next slide and then the following. As was already stated, or I'll come back to that in a second. So the reason why there is a robust housing and affordable housing section within the POCD is the result of a public act in 2017, PA 17170. The state legislature and the executive branch have made housing a priority statewide. And as a result of that, back in 17, they passed a piece of legislation that requires, and this is the statutory language here, at least once every 5 years, each municipality shall prepare an affordable housing plan for the municipality. All municipalities in Connecticut shall produce an affordable housing plan. Such plan shall specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the municipality. This is regardless of the 8-30G and the 10%, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's regardless of that. It is regardless whether you have 10% or 2% or 36%, that you still have to plan for affordable housing. I also want to be clear, and this is some of what was introduced earlier by the town manager, is this is not new. The statutory authority for both zoning, Section 8-2, and for the POCD, Section 8-23, since the early 1990s, have had provisions that municipalities must make provisions for the development of housing opportunity, including opportunities for multifamily dwellings for all residents of the municipality and the region, and then promote housing choice and economic diversity, including housing for both low and moderate income households. This is nothing new. In addition, there's mid-90s case law from the Connecticut Supreme Court that reviewed this language and determined it was a directive that municipalities must plan for these things, that it was not, a may, that it was being directed. With that being said, few, if any, municipalities took this seriously. Few, if any, POCDs included robust sections addressing housing and housing affordability. Jump ahead 25 years, and what does the legislature do? They pass PA 17170. That's a clear directive. Plan for affordable housing. Because you know what? No one listened to the prior statutory language. So that's essentially how we arrive here at this. In 2021, there was a controversial piece of zoning legislation called PA Public Act 2129 that made some substantial changes to zoning. While most municipalities yelled and screamed about accessory dwelling units and so forth, few paid much attention to a simple sentence within the ordinance, within the statute that said, zoning must affirmatively further the purpose of fair housing. This is a dramatic change in zoning law. Prior to this, zoning, while it's recognized that various governance powers need to not run afoul of fair housing, it hasn't been common to include fair housing specifically in zoning legislation. Let's just say, this is hypothetical, a developer proposed 300 housing units to the zoning commission back 5 years ago, and the zoning commission denies it because they don't want it. The developer may have had the ability to appeal the land use decision into the courts based on the policies and procedures of zoning to get a court to rule and maybe overturn the commission. Moving forward, that's going to change. There will be 2 lawsuits that come out of a housing issue. a housing application. One will be the land use appeal into the state courts, and the other will be a federal district court fair housing appeal, because now zoning explicitly must further fair housing. That means if you don't plan for housing and affordable housing, you run the risk of running afoul of fair housing. Next slide. This is your past 5 years of the 8-30G affordable housing list, the table up top for Enfield. And you're running in 2021 at 12.4%. I just want to show you, in 2020 you were 12.72, in 19 you were 12.63, in 18 12.41, in 17 12.27. This is a moving target because the government assisted, the tenant assisted, and the mortgages fluctuate year to year. Someone has a CHFA mortgage, they sell their house, the new buyer doesn't, and that number changes. So it's always fluxing a bit. It's moving around. It's not constant. The other thing is they're still using, as of 2021, the Department of Housing is still using the 2010 census to make those calculations for the total housing. You'll see the 17,558 in the first column there. I'm assuming when they finally release the 2022 numbers, they're going to update to the 2020 census, because those numbers have since been released, which your housing units increased by, I think, 181 or 183 units to 741. If all stays constant in the 2021 numbers, then you will drop to 1228, but we really don't know, 12.28. I also know there's been some talk about the 10% threshold within 8-30G. This is probably one of the most confusing sections of statute, or the most misunderstood sections of statute. The fact is, when the legislature adopted 8-30G back in the late 80s, the 10% was not established as a goal to achieve. The 10% was established to exclude the municipalities that already had a reasonable share of affordable housing so that they wouldn't be subject to 8-30G. Since its adoption, most communities in Connecticut that have less than 10% have viewed it as a goal to achieve, or municipalities have interpreted it as, so long as we have 10% affordable housing, we don't need to provide affordable housing. There's a difference between the 10% threshold and housing need. If you look on the bottom right here, HUD defines affordability as if you're paying more than 30% of your household income on housing, then housing is unaffordable. So 23.6% of your households with mortgage pay more than 30%. 18.7% without mortgages pay more than 30%. Renters, 47.5% of renters pay more than 30%. Total combined, 27.6% of households in Enfield pay more than 30%. Qualified affordable housing units, 2180 as we saw on the table above, and 12.42% affordable. Yes, you're over the 10% threshold, but no, you fall short of addressing what would be termed as housing need. Next slide. Why? Why is the renter number so high? Or why is there a need for housing? One of the biggest things is changes in demographics. And hopefully these numbers shock you because you probably don't realize them. The fact is, in Enfield, 29.2% of all households are single person. And 36.7% are two persons. So what? 67% of your households are just one or two persons. When you get into the renter category, the last column there, 40.4% of renters are single person, and 28.7% are two person, nearly 70% there. The fact is, when you're talking about a one-person household versus, let's say, a four-person family household, you're typically talking about one income versus two incomes. It's more challenging for single-person households. let me put this in perspective. In 1960 America, only 13% of households were single person. Today, nationwide, 28% of households are single person. We've changed. And single persons and two-person households need different housing than families. Remember those big families of the 70s? Those television shows like The Brady Bunch, 8 is Enough? That's the exception, not the norm today. The charts on the right-hand side, the bottom one, is what would be an affordable rent at 80% AMI in the bracketed column. For a one-person household, it would be $1,460 a month. Enfield's median rent for all rental units is $1,159. The fact is, an 80% AMI affordable unit would actually, to a single person, would actually rent for higher than your median rent. Now we recognize median, half are above, half are below. 60% AMI is $1,096, slightly below the $1,159. The interesting thing is the box on the right shows new multifamily rentals. These are new construction within the Hartford market. In general, studios run around $1,265, one bedrooms around $1,600, two bedrooms around $2,100, and three bedrooms around $2,400, $2,500. The 1 and 2 bedrooms actually fall, the studios and 1 bedrooms actually fall very close to 80% AMI. Studios actually qualify at 80% AMI, and 1 bedrooms may or may not at a given moment in time. The fact is, when we're talking about affordable housing, it's not very different than market housing. In market rates, if you look at the 100% AMI column, market rate housing doesn't exceed the 100% level. Market rents actually run around 92, 93% AMI. Next slide. So, as contemplated through the creation of the plan and discussing multifamily housing and benefits, market and consumer demand has shifted. The single-person household, the two-person household, want alternatives to the 3+ bedroom single-family detached house. If you go back to the early 2000s, only about 20% of housing per year in Connecticut being constructed was multifamily. Today, it's running around 47%. That's a shift in marketplace. Housing stock diversity and newer competitive product. Most of the multifamily product in the Hartford region is pre-1990, and it's outdated. Workforce housing. Housing is where jobs go at night. Homegrown future home buyers. Capture renters, and you have potential future home buyers for your homes. Can reposition underperforming commercial properties. This is probably the most important thing in the context of Enfield from my perspective. Additional consumer spending. Every one of those households will spend money in your community. Positive municipal tax revenue. Some conclusions around your housing stock overall. It's older and aging. It's predominantly single-family detached and owner-occupied. You have an ample missing middle housing stock, that is 2s, 3s, and 4s. You have a limited older multifamily housing stock, and then moderate housing affordability overall. The top graphic, the top table here is multifamily apartments. I use 4 apartment developments from recent times. One in Wethersfield, Heirloom Flats in Bloomfield, Tempo at Evergreen in South Windsor, and the mansions at Canyon Ridge in East Windsor. Those are the actual assessed values from their respective assessors cards. And that is Enfield's mill rate applied, and that's essentially the taxes they would pay. They total together, what, $2.4 million in taxes, 584 units. Next down is revenues. So we have property taxes at 2.4. We have an accounting of personal property taxes for motor vehicles at approximately $324,000 for $2.77 million total. Education expenditures. These are actuals based on the numbers of enrollments coming out of these developments and some calculations as to cost per enrollment. 117 enrollments, almost $10,000 per. and $1.1 million in expenses. General government expenditures, the cost of local government, another 382, I think. I can't see from here. 582, thank you. I need new glasses. So total expenditures, 1.7 million. Net fiscal positive, 1 million, if those 4 developments were actually here in Enfield. This is where it comes in with the target investment areas in your commercial properties. This is why the plan recommends multifamily housing in your BP, your BR, and your I-1. Enfield Square Mall, this is from your town records, was assessed at $61.9 million in 2011. It's assessed at $37.7 million. Based on today's mill rate, that's a loss of $800,000 in taxes over that period of time. Who's paying those taxes? When commercial values depreciate, the burden of the grand list shifts to the residential side of the grand list. So you, the residents, are paying higher taxes to make up for the depreciation in value at Enfield Square. Now, mind you, other commercial development has come in and so forth, and it's probably not exactly that. But do you want to reposition that mall? Demolish part of it, add 584 housing units to it, and gain back $1 million in revenue. That's the recommendation overall in this plan about multifamily development. How do you actually use it to A, comply with state law, and B, to reposition some of your struggling commercial properties? Mass Mutual, I know there's something potentially pending there, but Mass Mutual, Lego in that area, and then ultimately the Enfield Square Mall location and others. So with that, I believe, next slide, I say thank you and turn it back over.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. As the town council members regain the stage, I just also want to augment his presentation.